Oh yeah, here you go.
Alright.
Perfect. Plenty to go around. Alright, so quick review yesterday. We started off with a few questions, wondering how the Mishnah praises the day of the 15th of Av in such glowing terms. It says there is no days for the Jewish people greater than the 15th of Av and Yom Kippurim in the whole calendar. So basically, the Gemara over there asks, fine, Yom Kippur, I can understand, it's a day of great atonement for the Jewish people. What's the big deal about Tu B'Av? So we spoke yesterday, there's 5 or 6 different events that took place on the 15th of Av that the Gemara speaks about. The tribes were able to marry into each other from the times of the daughters of Tzlofchad. There is a pasuk that says that women should only stay married to their own tribes. So the 15th of Av was the day that they sort of undid that and said it only applied for her generation. So it was a day that all the the marriage between the tribes could happen. The tribe of Benjamin, who they had decreed that they shouldn't marry into their tribe, that was undone. And it was basically it lists over there many things. There's a whole litany of things, but the point is they all happened after in history. They weren't during the time of the Torah. So one of the questions we brushed upon later is that how can we say this is a greater holiday when it wasn't in the Torah? But in the meantime, we went into the specifics. It said that it was a greater holiday. It was the Lo Hayu Yom Tov Yisrael. There was no Yom Tov for the Jewish people like this one, which means it's greater than the 3 festivals, Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot. And because it says in that very phrase there were no Yom Tov for Yisrael, like the 15th of Av and Yom Kippurim, and the 15th of Av comes first, it means it's even greater than Yom Kippurim. So we have to understand why it's so great, basically. How is it possible? And 2 other questions he touched on is that if it's in the same phrase as Yom Kippur, it obviously has some connection with Yom Kippur, because it brings these 2 holidays in particular together. And also, why is this mentioned in the Gemara of Tainis, in the Mishnah regarding fasts, when seemingly talking about the greatness of the Yom Tov and the fast are opposite? What's it doing in that place in the Torah? Then we went through and started to say that really all the things that happened on the 15th of Av were an outcome of the primary greatness of the 15th of Av, which means they were all extensions from this, which is that the moon is full, right? That the very fact that the moon is full is what makes it the greatest holiday of all holidays. So we said it doesn't make sense. Every month has a full moon. So we started to describe that the greatness of the moon has to do with, the fullness of the moon has to do with its overcoming its lack, right? And so, since the lack in the month of Av is the greatest, the Jewish people are compared to the moon, and the moon of the month of Av is like our lowest point. Therefore, the fullness of the month of Av is our highest point, and it represents sort of the greatest return from darkness to light. So we said that really Pesach and Sukkot were maybe candidates for the same thing, because Pesach is also a return from a response to Yetzias Mitzrayim, which is pretty big low. So we answered that by saying that the Jewish people were considered like converts on the day of the 15th of the month, and therefore whatever was associated with their past did not get schlepped along with the elevation of their future in the moon becoming full. In other words, by the time they got the Aliyah, there was a response to the Yerida of Mitzrayim. They were already a new being, so the descent was not so much connected with the ascent. Similarly, we said by Sukkot that there's also the concept of a negative quality of the month of Tishrei, in that we're sort of filled with sin and have to be purged from this sin. So we said that nonetheless, Yom Kippur is already the rebound and the elevation that comes from the negative aspect of Tishrei, and Yom Kippur already happens on the 10th, and therefore the moon Pasha didn't get as full as it could have by the time it got to the 15th. So that the Aliyah that follows the Yerida is more limited, because the moon, the Aliyah represents sort of the fullness of the moon, and on the 10th of Tishrei, even though we've already in other words, we've already bounced back from our descent, because the descent is that we're filled with sin, and the rebound is that we become purged. That happens only on the 10th of the month, and so there's basically 4 more days of growing that didn't happen in that month. You follow that idea? Anybody besides who wasn't here yesterday?
Yeah, sure.
You with this?
Not really.
Not really? So ask a question, say I don't understand. So we're talking about, in general, the idea of the moon being one of revelation and concealment. This is what the moon basically does. It goes back and forth from revelation and concealment, right? Every month. But the idea is that the moon comes to a state of fullness. It would have helped, if yesterday we went into it in detail. The moon goes to a state of fullness on the 15th. And that represents basically the revelation of God, the aliyah of each month. Every month basically goes through a descent and an ascent. And just like the Jewish people throughout history, we go through building the base of Mikdash and destroying the base of Mikdash. Building our lives, destroying our lives. We're going through these cycles. And we're saying is that the high is commensurate with the low. As low as you go, as high as you're going to go. It's basically two things that are like a rubber band. The further you pull it, the farther it goes. So every month, the Jewish people have this sort of fall and rebound. But in Av, it's the greatest rebound because the fall is the greatest, because we lost the base of Mikdash in that month. So therefore, the 15th of the month of Av is the greatest day of the entire year, because the fall that happened is basically replenished and renewed with the full moon, representing like the fullness of revelation and the absence of any lack in the 15th of that month, and the 15th of every month really. But since that month is the lowest fall, it represents the greatest rebound. So then we said, okay, that's a strong statement to say. First of all, to say that the 15th day of Av is the greatest day just because it's the 15th. Right? Every month has a 15th. Why is this month greater than the other months? So we said there's other months that have holidays on the 15th, big holidays like Pesach and Sukkot are also on the 15th of the month. They don't count. So we said they also have the same exact pattern of like a fall and a rebound. It's just that the Rabbi giving different reasons why they don't compare quite. So we said just now that the fall of Nisan was basically the whole bitter exile of Egypt, which is you could argue is as great of a fall as the destruction of the base of Mikdash, theoretically. So, but why is the 15th of Nisan not as equal of an aliyah? So we said that because when the Jewish people celebrated the 15th of Nisan for the first time, we became Jews that day, basically. It was like a conversion of the whole Am Yisrael. And therefore the person that experienced the aliyah was not the same person that experienced the yerida. Because a person who's converted is considered like a brand new child who's just been born, doesn't have a past. So therefore, even though one could argue that Nisan also has the same level of descent and ascent, but it's not really a reciprocation, because it's like a brand new state. And even though Tishrei, Tishrei is in a certain sense like the fall of the golden calf, really it represents, because Yom Kippur is sort of the rebound of the golden calf, right? Nonetheless, since it's only on the 10th of the month, it doesn't go all the way to the 15th. So the elevation already happened soon. It's like premature, basically, so that the rebound doesn't go as high as it does as you allow it to go all the way to the 15th and push it the moon. You can see that there's more light, there's more revelation, there's more greatness on the 15th than there is on the 10th. So therefore, even though Yom Kippur also has a quality of going from darkness to light, it's still, the darkness isn't as dark, and therefore the light isn't as bright. Yeah, you follow?
Yeah.
And so then we said one more point, which is that it's a minor point, but just and for reviewing purposes, we said that we're calling into question this last thing that we just said, because really, even on the 10th of Av is also already the beginning of the Aliyah after Tisha B'Av. So it looks like Av and Tishrei are exactly the same. We don't really find a difference. The whole thing is, you said that the Aliyah only takes place on the 15th in the month of Av, and it already takes place on the 10th in Tishrei, and that's their difference. But in other places we find clearly that the Aliyah after the fall of the destruction happens right after the destruction is over. So the Aliyah also starts on the 10th of the month of Av, And therefore, what's the difference? You remember what we said yesterday?
We said we'll have to find out tomorrow.
No. We said that, definitely we said that, but not regarding this. We said that the difference is like this. The full aliyah happens on Yom Kippur. There's no more going up. It's just that there's 4 more days of revealing the aliyah that you just had. So that Sukkot, which is basically the 15th day of Tishrei, it's a revelation of what happened on Yom Kippur on the 10th day of Tishrei, right? But the full aliyah, the rebound of having gone down, is complete by the 10th. It's just that it starts to show itself, what you've garnered for yourself, begins to reveal itself and reveals itself in full on the 15th. Whereas by the month of Av, the aliyah begins on the 10th, as we said, but the aliyah doesn't stop on the 10th. You keep going higher on the 11th and higher on the 12th. Not just that you start to reveal the light of your aliyah on the 11th, 12th, and 13th, but that the actual going up continues to happen. You're going higher still. So again, the difference is one of, in Tishrei, the aliyah stops and you begin to reveal what the aliyah is. And in Av, the completion of the aliyah itself is on the 15th. Whereas, you just begin the aliyah on the 10th. Do you understand what I'm saying here or not exactly? You follow that?
Yeah, I mean, it's quite self-explanatory.
Okay.
It's subtle.
It's subtle or self-explanatory. Depends how you look at it. Okay. Fine. So we basically, where did we get up to? I think that's pretty much our review. Yeah, actually we did a little bit more. No, okay, we're going to start with Gimel. This is new. It says, Yuvan ze al pi hamavur. We can understand all of this, all of our questions, with what is explained in the Maimer that we're basing this whole thing on, which is, as you said yesterday, the Maimer from the Rebbe Rashab. Perush HaKasuf, the meaning of the verse, where it says, Yisron haaretz bekolhi, right? There's the advantage of the earth is everything. Melech l'sadeh ne'avad, right? And the king is even the king is enslaved to the field. So, translation one more time. The verse says, there's a verse from Koheles. It says that the earth is more advantageous than anything else. This is like sort of not necessarily word for word, but this is the meaning of it. The earth is the greatest thing there is, and even the king is enslaved to the field. Right? You can be the greatest king, but if the crops aren't good that year, basically you're out of luck. That's the simple meaning of it, right? But we're going to go into it a little bit deeper. What it means al pi Chassidus. So, because literally what it says is Yisron Aretz Bakol, that the advantage of Aretz, of earth, is Bakol, right? Is in everything, and in everything we're going to see it doesn't only mean everything. It's like a symbol for something else. Let's just move on to the Rebbe's explanation of it. He'll explain it clearly. The Eretz hu klalos ha'olam. So when it says that there's an advantage in the land, the Aretz, this represents the general world, the whole world. And Sadeh, whereas the end of the verse, when it says even the king is enslaved to the field, this represents Hamuvchar Sheba'aretz, the best of the earth. And who? Gan Eden. What does that represent? Gan Eden. So basically the verse speaks about the Aretz and the Sadeh, the earth and the field. Right? The earth is greater than everything. Even the king is subjugated to the field. So you see this verse talks about the earth and the field. What is the earth? Aretz represents the world, basically. And the field represents the best of the world. Right? The most choice of the world, which in this language represents Gan Eden. It represents basically the spiritual world. The chiluk zeh shebein klalus ha'olam laGan Eden, and this difference between the general world and Gan Eden, right? What's the real difference between the Aretz and the Sadeh? Sheklalus ha'olam nikra aretz v'gan Eden sadeh, that the whole world is called the aretz, and the Gan Eden is called the field. Hu b'shorshim. Where do they get their difference from? They get the difference from their source. In other words, what is the source of which produces the earth, and what's the source which produces Gan Eden? Tishavus ha'olam him b'chinas hadibur de Malchus. That basically the bringing existence of the world, the hisavus, the engendering of the existence of the world, comes from the level of the dibur of Malchus. What is Malchus? The last of the 10 spheros, right? And basically, what we're saying is that the Malchus itself has 10 spheros in it as well. Just like Malchus is the last of the 10 spheros, right? It itself has its own 10 spheros, just like all the Esser spheros are included with 10 spheros. And therefore you find that Malchus has basically a beginning and an end. The end of Malchus is basically Malchus of Malchus. And the beginning of Malchus, we're going to see, is called the Chabad of Malchus, the Chochmah Bin and Das of Malchus, the first 3 spheres of Malchus. So in general, Malchus is called speech, right? Malchus, as it says when we describe the spheros in every Erev Shabbos, when we read Pesach Eliyahu, it says Malchus Peh, right? Malchus is called the mouth, and speech. So basically, the last sphere of Malchus is called the Dibur of Malchus, the speech of Malchus. Malchus of Malchus is another way of saying that is the speech of Malchus, which is also called Chitzonius HaMalchus, right? The most external aspect of Malchus. And this is Nikra Aretz. This is what is called earth. In other words, we're saying that where's the earth come from? Where does Gan Eden come from? It comes from a difference in their source. What produces creation is the sphere of Malchus, right? In general, Malchus is sort of the mouthpiece of Hashem that makes existence happen. Whereas all the spheres above Malchus are like sort of the body of Hashem himself, and his ability to produce worlds comes from his sphere of Malchus. So in the sphere of Malchus, however, we're seeing that there's also the external aspect of Malchus and the internal aspect of Malchus. So his external aspect of Malchus creates the world, the lower part of the world, which is basically what we're calling the Aretz here, the worlds in general. And Gan Eden, the higher part of creation, which is basically the spiritual dimension of reality, Hu b'chinas gimel rishonos de Malchus. This is coming from the 3 first spheres of Malchus, which is Chochmah Bin and Das, or Penimius of Malchus. Right? So in general, what we're saying is that when Hashem is going to speak, which is his sphere of Malchus, his speech itself has an array of aspects to it. So the lower aspect of his speech creates the regular world, and the higher dimension of his speech creates the mystical, spiritual world of Gan Eden.
Is it speech or breathing for the higher?
He calls it, he doesn't really say. He doesn't really say necessarily, I mean, it's obviously some form of speech, because Malchus in general is speech. It's just now we're talking about the speech of Malchus, or the, so to speak, like the higher spheres of Malchus. So, in general, we're talking about worlds that have been created, right? So all the worlds, including this world and the higher worlds, are all created with speech, and therefore they all come out of Malchus. You follow that?
I thought for the higher being, spiritual, like angels, whatever, are by breathing. No.
Again, breathing and speech are similar, right? Because basically speech is just breath with...
One's more internal, isn't it? More of a concentration of intent?
Blowing, you're saying. Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Blowing, no. Blowing is different here. Blowing refers to something else altogether. Like when Tanya speaks about blowing, it's referring to specifically the Jewish neshama, right? That our soul in this body comes from a very, very deep place within Hashem. Just like the difference when a person has to blow, they use all their breath up all at once. Versus when they speak, they can speak for a long time.
Yeah.
So in the soul of a Yid is the breath. It's like the blowing of Hashem. Outside of that, everything else in reality is created by Hashem's speech. Beruach piv kol tzva'am, with the breath of his mouth, i.e. speech, he created them all. But now we're saying that in speech itself, there's 2 levels of speech. There's the external aspect of speech, which creates just stam the world, and there's the internal aspect of speech, which creates the higher worlds, basically, the more spiritual worlds, Gan Eden. And one of them is called, the first one is called the earth, and the second one is called the field, because just like a field is like a sort of more pristine aspect of the earth, so too there's a higher, in their source, there's a higher aspect of Hashem's speech, and therefore it creates the field, the garden of Eden. As the Maimer explains, we're basing this on the Rabbi Rashav's Maimer. Sha'adibur de Malchus. So when it comes to the speech of Malchus, the lower part of Malchus, this is called the Asara Maimaro Shebehem Nivra Olam. Right? These are the 10 statements with which Hashem created the world. And basically, so there's a lot of detail actually that's going on here. He's explaining us specifically where in the Sephardic, construction, these statements of creation came from. In other words, we talk about all the time in Tanya. We talk about in the Sefer Bereshit, Hashem created the world. In Pirkei Avos, Hashem created the world with 10 utterances. Right? What are those 10 utterances? So they are specifically the 10 spheros inside of Malchus of Malchus. In other words, so if you have the sphere of Malchus of Atzilus, then you go down to the bottom of it, and you get to Malchus of Malchus. That there's 10 spheros in there, right? Inside of Malchus of Atzilus, there's 10 spheros in there, right? So you go down to Malchus of Atzilus, right? And we're saying that you have in Malchus of Atzilus itself, you have the more external part, which is like the Malchus of Atzilus, versus the higher part, which is the 3 beginning spheres of Atzilus. And in that lower part, that's where the 10 statements are. So in Malchus of Malchus, there's 10 statements. And those are like the original words from Hashem's mouth that created the world. In Yono hu lahavos es hanivroim. And their purpose and their inyan is to bring into being the existence of creation. B'dugmas hadibur sheba Adam. Just like, for example, the speech of man. Bishvil hazulas. Why do you have speech? For the sake of another person being able to understand and relate with you. Not for yourself. Right? So too, the whole idea of the 10 statements of creation is for the other. In other words, it's for creation. The difference is when we speak, it's in order to address the other. When Hashem speaks, in order to bring into existence the other. But in the sense they're similar. The whole utility of it is for the union of something outside of you to create. With the Gimel Reishin, the Malchus, whereas if you go to the higher parts of Malchus, Hu Panimius HaMalchus, Shemekabelas Miyasod. And we're saying this is called the Panimius of Malchus, right? The more inner aspect of Malchus. And there you already have, it's not merely to give out, it's also to receive. The lower part of speech is only to give out. There's a higher part which is also able to receive. And what's the sphere above Malchus? Anybody?
Yesod.
Yesod, right? The sphere above Malchus is Yesod. I've got to brush up on the spheros here, guys. So the idea is that the upper end of Malchus, it touches the Yesod, it touches the lower end of Yesod, and therefore it also receives from Yesod. And basically the lower part of Malchus doesn't really receive from Yesod. The lower part of Malchus only receives from the other spheres within Malchus that are above it, right? But the idea of the higher part of Malchus, that it kisses, it basically has a connection with something which is totally beyond itself. What is so special about Yesod? Who's Siyuma Atzilus. The Yesod is called the end of Atzilus, really, in a certain sense. Siyuma the Gufa. Meaning to say what? That Yesod has a unique quality, really, in the construction of the spheros. There's 9 spheros, sort of plus 1. Because Malchus is a unique sphere in that it really represents like the feminine counterpart to everything that comes above it. Right? So the notion is that Malchus is really already the beginning of the other. Now it could be that the beginning of the other already starts in yourself. In other words, within you, you already have the concept of something external to you. Like within godliness, for example, he already had the existence of the worlds inside of him before he blew them into existence, right? But so there's already an aspect of duality within the unity inside of Hashem. So when it comes to the 10 spheros, all the 9 spheros above Malchus are sort of like Hashem, and the Malchus itself is like the feminine counterpart. It's like sort of the feminine quality of the other inside of Hashem. Right. So even when he's going to basically, blow it out and make existence come into being from it, it already sort of internally has a notion of separateness from himself. So Yesod, therefore, which is the sphere above Malchus, this is really the lowest sphere of Atzilus proper. In other words, it's still part of the pure unity of Hashem before it gets mixed in with this strange notion of Hashem having the other inside of him. Now, in truth, Malchus is still part of the world of Atzilus. And the idea behind there is that even the world that comes out in its true nature, it's also part of God, right? But it's the aspect of God which is relevant, so to speak, to coming out of him. So within Hashem, there's like a sort of dual nature, and even the duality aspect of it is really one with him. In other words, the sphere of Malchus is still part of Atzilus, and therefore it's united with Atzilus. But it's a slight difference, because there's already the notion of other within inside the one. Therefore, Yesod doesn't have this problem. Yesod is purely godly, right? It's purely part of the oneness. And therefore, Malchus, the top of it, who touches Yesod, it has a unique position there that it's able to experience like the pure level of godliness much more than the more external parts of Malchus, which are left to being in a state of separateness mamish. And therefore, there's an inner dimension to them that the outer does not have. And essentially it's because they're receiving from Yesod, which is called the end of Atzilus, Siyum de Gufa, right, which is called the end of the body. Yesod also represents basically the genitalia, basically, just like literally the end of the body.
Can you say then that the Yesod of Malchus is like love of this world, while the Malchus of Malchus is like more like lust when it comes to the individual?
Wait, we didn't talk about the Yesod of Malchus, though, right?
No, but you mentioned it.
No, we mentioned the Yesod, which is beyond Malchus.
Yeah.
In other words, in Malchus itself, what we discussed was the lower and higher parts of Malchus. So the lower parts is Malchus. Right. The higher parts we said is Chochmah, Bina, and Das.
Okay.
Right? The only thing is that the Chochmah, Bina, and Das of Malchus, it receives from what's above it. As opposed to just being something to give hashpah, it also receives what's from above it. And what's above it is the Yesod of Atzilus. Right. So that's what we're saying, is that it has access to like the true level of godliness, which is still totally united with Hashem. So in terms of, we didn't at this point discuss different levels of Yesod. In other words, whether it's lust or love, that Yesod at this point just represents full Atzilus, perfection, part of the body. Okay, it's the end of the body, but it's still part of the body. As opposed to, let's say, speech, which comes out of the body. Right? Malchus is the idea of speech. It's not part of the body anymore. It exits the body. Whereas, let's say, Yesod is the lowest part of the body, but it's still part of the oneness of the goof. It's not something that goes out. Right? So, okay. And we're saying that this is Bedugmas Hamido Shaba Adam. Now, what is Yesod? What is the mashal for Yesod? Whereas the mashal for Malchus is speech, the mashal for Yesod is midos, right? Midos is basically our emotional qualities. He says, "Da'agam shem shayachim lazulas," even though in a certain sense they're relevant and connected in some way to the other. Right? Because basically, when you're emoting, it's basically, your emotion isn't so much shy to like just being all by yourself on a desert island. It's not the same as like intellect, for example, where intellect is something that's relevant specifically to you. You can just sit there and intellect. When you're emoting, it's already an expression outward to some degree. It could be that you're having this expression outward to yourself, but still an expression outward. It's about the other. The other could be expressing it through you yourself as the other, and it could certainly go further and express to the other itself. But the point is that they still have a relationship to the concept of outwardness, to the other, But hari inyanam husha adam misorah mispala. But nonetheless, their whole Indian is that the person himself gets aroused and affected. So even though there's a notion of extension outward, it's not like speech, for example, which literally extends outside of your body. These are an extension of yourself, like an expression, but to yourself. Right? Because it's the person himself who's getting excited, feeling the emotion. Okay, so basically, what we're seeing here then is that just to sort of sum this up for a second, we're saying that there's the aretz and the sadeh, the field and the land and the field, and this is the world and Gan Eden. And the reason that there's a difference between them is because the source of them is different, right? What's the difference in their source? That the field comes from the higher part of Malchus, which is already relevant to Yeshod. And even though Yeshod is somewhat connected with the outside world, it's really all about self. It's that the person himself has emotions, right? And so therefore, it's the field is sort of like a higher experience. It's not purely related to the outside world. It's not purely external. There's an aspect of the field, which is Gan Eden, which itself receives from Yesod, which is something internal. It has a shaykhus to internality.
The very tip part of the show comes down into Malchus. What you're saying.
Where Malchus receives from Yesod, it therefore has some shaykhus to the Indian of Yesod, which is not something purely for the sake of the other. It's related to the other, but it's not purely for the sake of the other. And therefore, there's something which is not purely for the sake of the other, which is received by the higher part of Malchus. And therefore it creates Gan Eden, which is not purely for the sake of the other. Therefore it's like this sort of world of glory, which is not just totally external aspect of divinity, which has lost all contact with godliness. It still has itself in the picture. Whereas Malchus, the Malchus of Malchus, the lower part of Malchus, it's purely external, which means it doesn't have any of like the cream of the crop aspects of divinity, and therefore it comes out something where godliness is basically not so much felt in it. It's the most external aspect of godliness, that which is only relevant for the outside. Does everyone understand what's going on here? Yeah? You following any of this? Okay.
It's like a puzzle. You got to piece it together. So
You have to have a little map in your head, yeah, to see what's going on. We can draw it out if you. I'm not getting a lot of response, so I'm not sure if we're understanding or not. Okay, but anyway, Mosiv ba Maimer. If you want, we can draw it out, if that would be helpful. Mosiv ba Maimer, Yeshod Yisarim began Eden al Klalus Ha'olam. That there's another advantage of Gan Eden over the rest of the world. Right? Damshacha ba'olam hima amidos ki adibur de malchus mekabel ma'amidos. Damshacha b'gan Eden hima mochin. Okay, so he's taking the whole thing higher. In other words, it doesn't get any simpler. He's taking that same map and making it slightly more complex. And he's saying like this, that there's another advantage of the field over the earth, or Gan Eden over the world. And that is that the Hamshacha that goes into the world, that which is drawn down into the world, is primarily an inyan of Midos. It sounds slightly off, because what we just got through saying is that the higher part of Malchus receives from the Midos, from Yesod. But put that aside for 1 second and we'll get like a different picture of what he's trying to say here. He's saying that in general, the lower part of Malchus receives merely from the Midos, because in general, speech receives from Midos. In other words, when a person speaks, the speech is a result of what's going on in their emotional body, and the speech is like a direct result of how they feel. Primarily.
Is the speech more of like the intellectual part of the body?
The speech, well, you have basically, the breakdown goes, you have Chochmah, Bina, and Das, the Midos, right? And then the three garments, thought, speech, and action. So in general, the thoughts, all the three things called thought, speech, and action, they receive primarily from the midos. Because that's, again, the midos are not pure midos, because the midos themselves receive from the intellect. So whenever you're going to have an emotion, it's not usually just a complete, and there is no such thing as just raw emotion without any intellect sort of
Like an animal
behind.
emotion.
Even an animal emotion, there's some type of like reason for their emotion, right? And in humans, how much more so. But by the time it gets to your emotional state, the reason is not the primary glowing orb anymore. The reason sort of crawls inside of the emotional orb, and the emotional orb is what's happening. It's just that emotion has been brought to life by a certain level of intellect. But at that point, the intellect is not shining. The emotion is shining. The intellect is what making it shine like this rather than like this, right? So usually when people are speaking, they're speaking emotions. It's just that the emotion has been already received some form of intellect, which makes it come out in this emotional way. So in general, the speech receives from emotion, the midos. When the machshava, the hamshach of Gan Eden, however, is from the mochi. Right? What we're saying here is, however, what comes into Gan Eden and forms it is an inyan from mind, which is beyond midos. So basically, I really think we have to draw this out. It's just going to be easier.
This is all going to come back to the 15th of God.
Maybe. Adam, can we see that pen for a second in front of you? All right, let's have it.
Where's your whiteboard?
Yeah, that's a good question.
I was just thinking it's time to make
Time to
one.
crack it open.
We have one somewhere. I don't know.
We need to make one with the spheros on it.
All right, let's see if we
already.
can figure out what we're doing here. Okay. So I'm going to make this Malchus like really big. Okay. Alright, so I'm going to do mind, midos. Okay, so here's what we said so far. Can everyone somewhat see this little thing?
That's pretty tough.
No? Come around. You have here the mind and the heart, right? Yeah? Here, okay, we'll just sit like that. So you have the mind and the heart, right? These are the three spheres of intellect, Chocham, Bina, and Das. These are the seven spheres of the emotions, right? And then, or the sixth sphere of emotion, and the seventh is Malchus, right? So in Malchus, in general, the whole Malchus, we're saying is called speech, right?
All of them, yeah, okay.
Is that how you spell it? Right? And
A-C-H, okay.
okay, and this is in general called speech. But there's the internal and the external. And that's why we colored here in black, right? Or whatever, colored in. The internal is the Chabad of speech, which is the three, what we're calling the three top spheros of Malchus.
And the other seven?
And the external, forget these for a second.
Oh.
And the external is called Malchus of Malchus, the external part. So this is called speech of speech. This is called like brain of speech, right? And basically what we're saying is this, from this lower place is where the earth comes, is created from. And from the higher places where the Gan Eden is created from, right? In other words, this whole thing, remember, is called speech, right? So when Hashem speaks from this dimension of His speech, right, He creates Gan Eden. And when he speaks from this lower dimension of His speech, He creates the earth, the regular world.
All of Gashmias.
Yeah, all of the Gashmias, I would say, right? So now what we're saying is...
And what about us? We're created...
Also,
the bottom one, right?
Also, well, it depends. Part of us is like our soul, which is created above, and that's created, there's different elements of us.
Okay.
Right? So in general, you've got these two dimensions of reality. Now what we're saying is that the reason why this one, the Gan Eden reality, is a more refined, beautiful reality, is because it's close to this sphere right here called the Yeshod, right? So it actually receives directly from this dimension of things, which is basically Atzilus proper, right? Whereas this sphere down here, it doesn't really have anything to do with what's going on up here. So it's out of the conversation. This is speech, but it receives from the midos, right? It receives from this sphere, so it has a much more glorious tinge to it. And that's one of the things we said, is that it receives from the end of the body of Atzilus, which is called Yesod, and therefore it gives it like this splendor. Okay? That's the first stage. Now, the reason we drew this out is because of the second stage, it gets more complicated. Does everyone understand that though? Yeah? Okay, so now we're saying is like this. There's another advantage of Gan Eden over the earth. And that is, in general, speech usually receives only from the midos, in general. This is like sort of an outside conversation, but just to understand that when a person speaks, what's usually happening, the words of their speech are usually an expression of how they feel. Again, we mentioned how they feel may itself be a construct of their intellect, making them feel that way, but ultimately it's their feelings that they're expressing. So speech in general expresses emotions. Whereas this area of Chochmah, Bina, and Das, right, it is an expression of mind. Right? So this earth in general, the only thing that it can really nourish from is the realm called emotions, midos. Whereas this higher part, which is the Chochmah, Bina, and Das of Malchus, it has access to receiving from mind something which is completely beyond emotions. The lowest part of speech doesn't have any access to anything but emotions, essentially. Like the root of all that can ever come out of it is emotions. Whereas the higher part of speech, it can have some access also to the intellect. Because if you think about it, it is possible to speak your intellect, right? It's much more rare. Person who's like, it's like transmitting like a mimer or something like that, right? Usually what comes out of your mouth is already been filtered. Whatever intellectual process you have, it gets filtered through your emotional process, and then you speak. Normal speech is basically an expression of emotion, but enlightened speech is like a pure transmission of mind. So this is another difference between Gan Eden and Earth, is that the higher aspects, the Panemius of Malchus, the higher aspects of Malchus, they can receive directly from mind, whereas the lower aspects can receive only directly from emotions. So this is another aspect of this conversation here. Okay.
So ask this question about that. So how does it play out on this planet on individuals? Does it make we're created the lowest? So the speech of Malchus, it's more like a physical, passionate thing, how we act, and if we access from the...
I would say that it's more like, I guess you could say, the difference between Torah speech versus regular speech.
Okay.
When a person is usually just talking about how they feel, right, it's not like they're not channeling the pure intellect, right? They're expressing their emotions, right? Whereas when a person is speaking Torah, again, like let's just say you're reading the words of Rashi or something like that, or you're reading the Chumash, right? Or saying them over, whatever, your speech is not necessarily filtering itself through an emotional process at that moment. The intellect is just directly translating into words of speech, right? So the speech faculty, you can see, the speech faculty is a kli, it's a vessel, right? The mouth is basically whatever you put into it comes out. So normally what you put into it is lower aspects of yourself, and therefore what comes out of the mouth is only a kli for emotions. But if you're speaking Torah or pure wisdom, okay, then what comes out of the mouth, it doesn't get filtered through the emotions, and it comes straight out from the mind, and it creates speech straight from intellect. So this, on a cosmic level, God is also having these two parts of speech. And the Gan Eden, right, is his speech from like a pure standpoint of intellect. Whereas the rest of the regular world, that's why it's called the choice of speech, like the field, the choice of the land. Whereas the regular land is him speaking, having allowed his his intellect to already enclose itself into emotions and then speak. And therefore it comes out not the choice of the land.
So the pure wisdom bypasses the emotions.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Okay. Okay, I think we're going to hold here for now. Shkoyach.
Solid foundation, these things.
Yeah, we have to go over the spheros in general, I think.
Right.